So what if I were to tell you that something massive is in Meltdown inside Russia? Now, sometimes I, like other creators, try to pique your interest by leaning into a little bit of deliberate ambiguity and clickbait. But in this case, there really is something massive that's arguably in Meltdown concerning Russia's foreign policy, and specifically its military operations in Western Africa, otherwise known as the Sahel, and where it has been lauded as the solution to the region's jihadist problems. You see, for years, Mali's military government had insisted it had found an answer plaguing this sub-region of the world. France, leading a Western coalition of forces, was gone, and the neo-imperialist claims of its ambitions as well. Russia had arrived, and with it a completely unique and renewed approach to dealing with this issue. But now something remarkable is changing, and changing very fast. This is the moment that Mali's entire political and security model starts to crack, but therefore it becomes one of the biggest credibility tests and arguably failures of Russia's operations in Africa, its ability to project power. With all that in mind, in this video I wanted to break down what's been going on in Mali over the past few days, why these attacks matter far beyond the country, of course, what it means for Russia going forward, and why this crisis bleeds into the much bigger shift in the balance of power and the direction that the world is heading.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going? Welcome to the channel where, if you're interested in geopolitics, but not purely based on lazy interpretations or simplistic assumptions, and how it actually links to, say, strategy, economics, or international relations, you're in the right place. Returning our attention this time to Mali, a country that is mentioned sometimes in the broader scheme of things. It appears in headlines briefly when there's, say, a coup, a terrorist attack, or another migration crisis tied to instability in West Africa or the broader world. But Mali matters much more than people realize because it's an epicenter of great power competition. It's not simply an isolated conflict. It sits at the center of a wider regional structure that you could arguably stretches across the Sahel, the vast belt running from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, but also arguably from Washington to Moscow. It is a region increasingly shaped by military juntas, collapsing state authority, jihadist expansionism, foreign intervention, resource competition, and of course that great power competition. Mali has become a test case. Can Russia succeed where France failed, for example? Can military rule bring stability over the failed attempts at democracy? Can counter-terrorism campaigns or coin work without legitimacy or political reconciliation? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when an entire government builds its survival around one external security partner? Well, that is the question I put to you before going further. Do you think that Russia's model in Africa is working? Is it even sustainable, or is Mali showing the limits of such a military-backed influence, and when countries overstretch themselves in a world that is inherently now unstable? Let me know in the comments below. Now let's bring you up to speed with the situation of Mali. Indeed, the conflict within the country itself and the broader region has never been one of continuous violence or conflict. It has ebbed and flowed with things such as raids or outbursts, pockets of violence, flare-ups, but never sustained for too long. Then suddenly came, in the late part of April, a sudden set of offensives, the most notable beginning on Saturday. And what makes this one different was simply not the violence itself. It was the scale, because the attacks erupted across multiple locations simultaneously. Militants were moving with this coordination, planning, and surprised operational discipline that isn't really reflective of, say, non-state actors like jihadist groups. So it wasn't a scattered insurgency, it was more of an orchestrated offensive which takes careful amounts of time to plan. And perhaps the biggest shock of all of this appeared to be that they were working together in two such coordinated amounts. Two major armed movements, groups that historically led different goals and sometimes even clashed themselves, were working together. Now, the first of these is known as JNIM, or Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin. I know I'm not going to say that perfectly well, but essentially it is an Al-Qaeda-linked jihadist coalition that has been active across Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. JNIM has spent years fighting the Malian government and gradually expanding influence across rural territory. The second actor of these is known as Azawad Liberation Front, known as the Tuareg separatists, that are a minority group seeking autonomy or independence, complete independence, for the north of Mali. The Tuareg rebellions are not new. They have actually shaped Malian politics for a long time. But what is new is that the jihadists and the separatists are now, at least tactically, maybe not strategically at that level of vision, aligned. And that changes almost everything in the eyes of some. Because if these two movements can coordinate, then Mali is no longer facing fragmented insurgencies. It faces a unified pressure campaign, which changes the calculus for the incumbent authorities and, of course, the external parties supporting them. Now, we'll come to that later on in the video. Now, the main area, the hotspot, is around Kidal. Kidal isn't just another town, it's the symbolic heartland for the Tuareg separatism. For years, it represented the political military centre of northern resistance. Rebels controlled it for extended periods, and then, therefore, when Malian forces that were backed by the then Wagner mercenaries of Russia retook Kidal in late 2023, it was portrayed as a major victory, indeed for the Malian authorities themselves, but of course for the independent movement and operations of Wagner Group in the aftermath of the Prigozhin assassination. The message was clear that the government was reclaiming territory and that Russia was delivering results that France never was. The junta could project strength. But of course, now the reality is changing rapidly, with Russian-backed forces having to have agreed to suddenly a withdrawal. Tuareg groups claim Kidal is once again under their control, with convoys having left military positions, and Russia, just as I was finalizing this script, admitting that the position had been lost. Military bloggers across Telegram criticizing and demonstrating bluntly that this was yet another illustration of Russia's growing weakness and inability to project power because of mainly problems at home. Losing it suggests that gains made over the past few years may have been far more fragile than anyone ever advertised, and symbolic defeats matter enormously, especially in insurgencies, because wars are not about the maps, they're always about the momentum, the perception, or the optics as I call it, the psychology, and the belief that one side is advancing whilst the other is retreating. The most shocking development of this is that the defense minister has been effectively killed in a car bomb. His residence near Kati, a military stronghold that has been linked to the junta leadership even before it took over, was destroyed in this explosion. It would mean militants successfully penetrated the government's inner security environment, and that matters because authoritarian entities survive on the perceptions of control. Indeed, any attempts to say that the Russian government, the Afrika Korps, as it's known now, is somehow in control, has not been able to be sustained because the Russians have had to admit that they withdrew. And so that undermines the imagery of not just the foreign entity providing support, but the government that has asked it. But now we come to the centrality of this story. Russia's role, its relevance, and why it arguably matters more than simply what's happening in Mali alone. To understand what has happened, you have to understand France's role as Mali's primary security partner. France troops intervened in 2013 after the jihadist and separatist groups seized large swathes of the north. Paris launched Operation Serval and then later Operation Barkhane. The mission initially pushed back the militants, but over time resentment grew, many Malians beginning to see France as either ineffective, paternalistic, or just simply not delivering lasting security. It was framed in pro-Russian camps as simply a neo-form of colonialism. Therefore, the anti-French sentiment grew, military coups followed, and Colonel Assimi Goïta consolidated power in 2020 and 2021. France subsequently left, and Russia entered. Now, this was through the Wagner Group, the infamous paramilitary organization that deployed fighters to Mali to support the junta. their role being simple of training troops, fighting insurgents, protecting strategic sites, offering political backing, but without the added drag of democracy and emphasis of human rights and rule of law that was associated with Western operations and institutions. But once the Wagner mutiny failed in June of 23, the Wagner Group was replaced or rebranded more accurately as Afrika Korps. Unlike Wagner's earlier semi-private structure, Afrika Korps was directly led and tied to by the Russian state and Ministry of Defense. Mali became one of its flagship deployments, a demonstration of Wagner's capability, of Afrika Korps, of Russia's capability to export its military influence in a different form. This meant Mali was not just another client, it became part of Russia's wider geopolitical framing, especially as its role in the Middle East was waning. A proof of concept, if you like. An example Moscow could show to others and work with us instead of the West. But that strategy only works if security improves. And right now, the security is completely deteriorating. Now, the issue isn't just Mali. It, of course, extends to the broader Sahel. Burkina Faso and Niger have experienced their own military takeovers, and all three states have drifted away from the Western framing and towards their own. There's even the discussion of the alliance of Sahel states, or a broader sort of united front, an alternative political bloc built around military cooperation and just basically anti-Western sentiment. The idea, of course, sovereignty, regional independence, and security without external lectures. But the reality has proven far more harder, with jihadist violence continuing to expand and threatening the already pretty weak state authority. In some places, insurgent groups control the entire taxation systems, the local governance. It's sort of like what we saw in the early phases of ISIS and its caliphate. For ordinary people, the distinction between, therefore, state control and militant influence is very blurred, and this matters because instability in the Sahel, it rarely stays contained. It often spills over into the broader Western African sphere as a whole, and why Trump has undertaken attacks against Boko Haram or arms traffickings and things we've seen in late 2025. Eventually, of course, that pressures Europe to get involved because of the threat of irregular and illegal migration flows that could threaten southern NATO and its flank, for example. But of course, this all soon brings us back to the role of Russia, because Russia is just simply repeating an old mistake here. Well, the mistake of believing that military force alone can somehow stabilize deeply fractured societies. These are comparisons that are being drawn to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, not because the situations are identical, but because of the pattern. Heavy military involvement, reliance on local proxies or groups, but limited political legitimacy, which, as one of our guests, General David Petraeus, has emphasized, you have to win the will of the people in insurgency operations for them to be effective. Well, then nothing ever changes. One such example is with Tuareg forces being ambushed at a joint Wagner-Malian convoy. The losses were severe, Russian mercenaries died, vehicles were destroyed, and basically it was a massive setback for the operations of a seemingly much more professionally trained and vastly more experienced and kitted out entity than a group of rather disbanded African jihadists. But the point is that this is not conventional warfare, and therefore sending in a traditional sense of warfare military operations and conducting them under perhaps a slightly outdated or very outdated playbook, as people argue in the case of Russia's, means that they're not going to succeed. You need governance, you need legitimacy, economic opportunity, political agreements. You need a people-centric approach to counterinsurgency operations, not simply one that is about enemy-centric or destroying your enemy. Of course, this all therefore brings us to the question of, can Russia involve deeper involvement? Because Moscow is already heavily committed elsewhere. The war in Ukraine completely consumes its resources, its logistics, operations, ammunition, personnel. And some reports suggest that Russia has been pulling back, redrafting, reorientating, redeploying troops from Mali back into Europe. Witnesses have described Russia's mercenaries fighting near Bamako as basically nothing more than a few dozen individuals. And there are claims that Africa Corps as an entirety hasn't been seen in places where it was the sole security provider just a few weeks ago. So when insurgencies intensify suddenly and in asymmetrical ways, as that's what defines their type of conflict, well, you cannot expect Africa Corps to be reacting in the same way. But if Russia pulls back, it looks weak. But if it escalates, it becomes more exposed. Either outcome carries costs. And that is why Mali suddenly matters far beyond West Africa. It is not just about one government fighting militants. It's about whether Russia can sustain itself as a security guarantor, or simply a growing demonstration that the inevitable deterioration of Russia, because of not only its war in Ukraine, but its internal coherency and economic situation, is allowing it to operate in the same way that it likes to claim that it is. But of course, that's all what's been. What could happen next? Well, one possibility is that Mali's government does somehow regain control. The Russian support may intensify, more weapons arrive, counter-offensives push back, albeit after a bit of time has occurred. Ultimately, the junta survives. Another is that simply there is a grinding war of attrition. The cities that are under dispute right now remain contested. Infrastructure becomes even more vulnerable, and the capital remains or increasingly sees instability, with confidence in the regime and therefore Russia eroding quickly. But there is the third possibility, that these attacks expose something deeper, that Mali's model itself is breaking down, because security partnerships can buy time, but they do not automatically create legitimacy. And regimes that rely heavily on the coercion instead of the incentivization often discover that military victories are easier to announce than they are to sustain. What makes this moment dangerous isn't just the violence, therefore, it's the convergence of the trends. The jihadist expansion, the Tuareg mobilization, the Russian reputational failure, and of course, growing pressure. And ultimately, how this bleeds into the overall exhaustion of the population and the regional instability. Whether or not we could see yet another failed state in a part of the world which is experiencing far too many of them for far too long already. Ultimately, we will see what happens in the coming days. As I record this script, as I say, things are changing, but it looks like the jihadists have the upper hand, and this unique combination of separatist jihad coalition is going to prove a big test case for Russia and whether Putin can actually put actions where his words are. Spoiler alert, I'm not so sure. But perhaps most importantly, Mali reminds us of something larger, that foreign powers can enter the conflicts. They can send the weapons, they can send the advisors, the mercenaries, the money. But stabilizing the country or taking it over, winning a war, to think of another individual with a strongman-like sense of self and launching a war of choice against another and is now stuck in a seeming never-ending set of ceasefire negotiations, it's very hard to escape from. But that's it from me, everyone. I'll be back with an expert on this in the following few days. I'll be also doing some more coverage of it independently, as well as, of course, looking at the war in Iran, the war in Ukraine, and many things else other around the world. So if you enjoy that, then do subscribe, do like the video, it helps, it's free, and check out the links in the description for more ways to support the channel, and also this video on screen now about what this all means for China and much more else. Take care.